Hello and welcome to the Pastor's Study. This is the week following Easter, and that means that my Lenten series on the Lord's Prayer is complete because Lent is complete. We're out of the season of Lent and we are in the season of Easter now. And so for these midweek videos going forward, I'm going to be picking at different topics. I may settle on a series here at some point, but for now, I'm just sort of going to pick different topics, different teachings, different resources, and talk a little bit about those. So today, I wanted to focus on this letter that Martin Luther wrote fairly early on in his ministry, maybe around the midpoint of his ministry, really, called "Whether One May Flee a Deadly Plague." And you may guess why this particular letter feels relevant right now, because Luther was writing this in the midst of an outbreak of the bubonic plague, actually in Wittenberg, Germany, where he was, and in some of the surrounding area. And the question came up whether a Christian may flee from this, and whether pastors in particular may flee from the plague. So if the plague was coming into their city or was in nearby cities, was it permissible for them to flee from this plague, or were they obligated rather to remain in place where they were for various reasons? And so this question is coming up during this outbreak in 1527, so nearly 500 years ago now. And so Luther writes an open letter to the people who have asked him this question. And the letter takes a while to write. He starts it in July of 1527, and the plague hits Wittenberg in August. And then he doesn't actually finish the letter and send it out till November. So during this time, he is writing this, before, in the middle of, and after this outbreak of bubonic plague. Now, this is not the big outbreak of the plague that we call the Black Death that killed one quarter of Europe's inhabitants. That had happened actually, I think, about 150 to 200 years earlier in the 1300s, and this is in the 1500s. But after that, the plague just sort of kept popping up in different places in Europe, basically until I think like the 17 or 1800s, something like that. I don't know the exact dates on that. You can look up more and find that for yourself. But this is not a widespread pandemic of the plague, but an epidemic that is somewhat local, or at least regional, at the time that Luther is writing this. And so when we heard of the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, we being church leaders, and we were thinking about what our response should be. This was before there was a mandatory stay-at-home order, but what our response should be as far as worship goes, and what our obligations were as far as whether we should continue to meet for worship or what we should do. One of the things that I did is I went and I read this letter from Martin Luther, some 500 years ago, just as a way of helping me to think through what are our obligations as Christians, what are our obligations as spiritual leaders, our being pastors and other lay leaders in the church, during a time like this. And of course, our pandemic is nowhere near as severe or as deadly as the plague, which had happened obviously earlier in Europe and then also during Luther's time. I don't know what the actual numbers were this particular outbreak of the plague, but it was quite deadly in this community. And obviously our situation is quite different, but still some of the same issues are at hand, and some of the same ethical reasoning according to what Scripture teaches us, what God has commanded, and what God has promised. How do we make ethical decisions in responding to something like this in that time? One of the things to keep in mind, if this is a letter you could go and find yourself online. I think there's several versions of it available online. You should be able to find, if you just search for Martin Luther, "Whether One May Flee a Deadly Plague." I'm pretty sure you could find it. But one thing to keep in mind as I talk about this and work through it a little bit is just how different the world is in Luther's day. So some 500 years ago. So you think about what's going on, sort of scientifically and medically at this time. They have no idea. Germ theory has not been thought of yet. So nobody has any idea that there are germs, that there are little bacteria or viruses, things that actually, get into people's bodies and make them sick. They don't have this concept, and so people have all sorts of ideas of where the plague might come from. Luther, in this writing, he says that what he thinks is happening is there's some sort of poison in the air. He blames it. I say there's evil spirits among us who are poisoning the air, or people are exhaling poisonous vapors, and those vapors then make other people sick. So even though they didn't understand anything like the intricacies of how the plague was spread, today we know that it was carried by rats and transferred via fleas, and then could also be transferred person to person. They at least knew that exposure to someone who was sick with the plague, who was infected, there was a good chance that you would be infected if you were exposed to somebody who's infected. So they at least knew that much. Luther talks about fumigating the air at one point. I have no idea what you would do to fumigate the air, but you can think of it as essentially like sanitizing, as many of us are doing far more now than perhaps we were used to. But even though he has a pretty rudimentary understanding of the virus, or of the plague rather, it's his response is actually, I think, very applicable for us today. The other thing that's entirely different is the idea of sort of a public health system. So whereas it's taken for granted that if you're sick enough, you'll go to a hospital, and that there are hospitals that are just there for people to come when they are sick, right? In Luther's day, that was not at all taken for granted. There were some public hospitals, but there were not very many of them. And so for the most part, in Wittenberg, for example, if someone was sick, they were cared for in their own home, or they were taken into someone else's home. In fact, during the plague outbreak, Luther, the Luther household, they had this large home that they lived in, and there were always people staying with them, and households in that day were larger too. So you'd have household servants, and a lot more people involved than just the parents and the children as you'd have today. But it served as something of a hospital for Wittenberg, as they were working to treat all of the people who were becoming sick. Luther himself was treating sick people, caring for sick people in his home, and in fact, even firsthand experienced the sort of death that the plague would bring, just by being there as people were dying of this, and firsthand caring for them, both spiritually and physically, as this happened. So that's kind of an idea of the world it's in. Very different from our world, of course, where we have hospitals and public health systems and the sorts of organization and scientific understanding that they had no idea of at that time. But I think it's interesting because really the ethical thinking hasn't changed that much of how should we respond to this. So when the plague started coming, Luther's prince, so the ruler of the region he was in, of Saxony, made a couple pronouncements. First, he ordered that the university in Wittenberg be moved to an area that was safer, and so the university was moved. And then he also ordered that Martin Luther specifically should go to a safer area, because his prince knew that Martin Luther brought a lot of fame to his region, and so it was in his interest to protect Luther. He also agreed with Luther on a lot of the reforms that Martin Luther had been arguing for, and so really wanted to protect him at all costs. But Luther would not go. So the university did move, and it moved for, I think, a period of something like 8 or 9 months, until the plague had passed. But Luther would not go. So he and Bugenhagen, who was the pastor of the church in Wittenberg, they stayed, and they stayed because they understood themselves to be obligated to stay and help care for those who were sick, especially to provide spiritual care for those who were sick and those who were dying, because there just weren't other people to do the work. And so they stayed actually against the government's orders, you could say, at risk to themselves, because they felt this call. So that's sort of where Luther is when he's writing this letter. So let's talk about this letter that he writes itself, and I'll just sort of run through it and run through the argument that he's making and the advice that he gives. What is his response? Is it permissible for a Christian in particular, to flee from a deadly plague? And so he starts off by saying what some people are arguing. Some are saying that the only proper response for a Christian in a plague like this is to remain where you are and to accept the plague as God's judgment. That because the plague has come and because God is in control of all things, the plague is coming by the will of God, and therefore, these people would argue, it is sinful for a Christian to flee from this. Instead, you should submit to it, and if the plague takes you, that is God's will, and if the plague spares you, that is God's will. But because we have faith in Jesus Christ, who has defeated death, because we have no need to fear death, we ought to essentially make no changes when something like a plague comes. Rather, we should just bow our heads and submit to it. And Luther's initial response isn't maybe what ours would be, of just sort of outright dismissing something like this. In fact, he says, there's actually something commendable, he says here, because it's true, we really do have no reason to fear death. There is no, our faith is, or ought to be strong enough that we can face any sort of threat, any sort of evil, and simply accept it and entrust ourselves to God in the midst of this. However, he says, it's true of Christians in general that only a few are strong in faith like this, whereas most of us have a weaker faith, where it would be very hard. We would be overcome by fear rather than being able to stand strong in faith in the midst of such a threat like this. And so he says, he refers to, for example, Romans 15, which says, we who are strong ought to put up with the failings of the weak, or I think a little better, the weakness of those who do not have power is a little closer there. But we who are strong ought to put up with those who are weak. And he refers to Romans 15, and he says, this is the way that God desires the church to be. This is the way that God desires Christians to be, is to band together. And so we cannot just simply say everyone must, stay put and submit to this plague as though it is the will of God for them, and entrust themselves entirely to God without taking any precautions for themselves at all. Rather, he says, if you can do that and not sin and be, strong in faith, go for it. But he says for most of us, we simply aren't able to make this sort of a blanket recommendation or a blanket commandment for Christians, that you should just stand there and bear it. It's interesting. I mentioned that this letter is sort of written in parts. Early in the letter, he's much more sympathetic to this view, and as you get farther and farther along into the letter, he actually comes more and more against it, which I don't really know, but it seems possible that as he's actually experiencing the plague and as he's going through these months of disease in Wittenberg, that he is maybe modifying his view a little bit. At least I think his basic view stays the same, but maybe modifying just the emphasis or the merit of what he's hearing. And so he says, okay, so we can't make this a blanket principle. So how do we know? I mean, how can we make our decisions about whether we flee or whether we stay, about how we respond to something like this? And throughout this, the guiding principle that is going to guide everything that he does is, first off, we are obligated to care for our neighbors. And neighbors, I don't mean just the people who live near us, but all of those people with whom we are in some kind of relationship. It doesn't mean like know them necessarily, but if you live in the same community, you are embedded in that relationship of being in that community. So for Luther, for example, living in Wittenberg, he is obligated to the people who live right around him. He's obligated to the people in his household, whether he's related to them or not. He's obligated to his friends. He's obligated to the other, maybe strangers in Wittenberg, just because they're all Wittenbergers together, right? They all live here together in this community. And so there's an obligation here. And so the principle is that we are obliged, we are obligated by God, we are responsible to God for our neighbors. And if our neighbors are in need of us, then our responsibility is to tend to that need. That's the first consideration. However, he makes clear to say, it is no sin to flee from a plague if your neighbors are not in need of you, if they are not, laying sick in their household alone, unable to care for themselves. For example, remember, this is a time, there's no hospital in Wittenberg, right? So people are very reliant on their neighbors. As long as that's not happening, it is no sin to flee, to protect yourself. It's no sin to care for yourself. And so as he starts this, he addresses various people. So first he addresses those who are in public office. And the first public office he addresses is the spiritual public office. So pastors, preachers, and church leaders, essentially, and so on. And he says, well, we must remain. As spiritual carers of the community, we must remain, because this is especially the sort of time and difficulty where people need to be comforted, where people need to hear God's word, where people need to hear the promise of the gospel more than ever. And so he says, as pastors, as preachers, we must remain in order to care for these people. Now, he says he makes an exception where if there's a lot of clergy in the town and there's sort of an agreement that, if only 3 of us stay, we'll be able to tend to the needs and the rest of you can go. He says that's fine. But what is the defining guiding principle there is that the spiritual needs of the people in the village, those who are sick, those who are dying, must be tended to, and we're obligated to that. He refers to John chapter 10, where Jesus says, for example, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. Yet I am the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And so Luther essentially says we're called, as spiritual leaders, we are called to be imitators of Jesus, the good shepherd, not to be simply like the hired hands who run at the first sign of trouble, but rather those who will lay down their life for the sheep, as Jesus laid down his life for us. Then he talks about others in public office, and he's thinking pretty broadly here, but he especially mentions like mayors of cities, for example. He mentions other sort of government officials, and he says, well, they must stay as well. They must stay because the governing and the order and the well-being of the community, of the city, relies on them. And so they cannot leave unless somehow they can, bring in some substitute, or they can make provisions to make sure that their duties, their obligations are met, are fulfilled one way or the other, and whatever that might look like. And it would probably entail some kind of ongoing supervising, which is hard to see how exactly that could happen in a time in Luther's day when there was no sort of phone or internet communication like we would have today. But he says essentially that same principle follows, that your obligations of your vocation, of your calling, the obligations that God has placed around you by putting you in this network of this community of relationships, those must be tended to. You're not free to abandon your neighbors or your citizens or your subjects or whatever. You're not free to abandon them in order to care for yourself. Rather, even if it involves danger to you, you are obligated to those responsibilities. And then he moves to those who don't have public offices, and he's thinking about the people in his household, and he's clearly thinking about this in terms of his own household. So he says, well, really the same principle applies for everyone, because all of us have these daily vocations, these daily obligations, these relationships that God has placed us in, and we're responsible to them. So he talks about household servants. So he says, servants, you should not abandon your masters, and he says the same to masters. Masters, you must not abandon your servants. You are mutually responsible to each other. You are responsible to God for each other's well-being. He says the same about parents and children. Both parents being responsible for their children, but also children responsible for their parents. He talks about other family members. He talks about neighbors. So, the people that you live near, the people of your community. Really, there is this web of relationships in which we live. And he says you're not free to simply abandon them. If your neighbor is lying sick and dying in their house, and no one can care for them, then you are obligated to go and care for them. That is actually God's call on you. And he refers to Jesus in Matthew 25. If you remember the story of the sheep and the goats, one of the things that Jesus says, both to those who are being rewarded and those who are receiving punishment, to those who are being rewarded, he says, I was sick and you visited me. To those who are receiving punishment, he said, I was sick and you did not visit me, right? So clearly this is something that matters. This is something that we are obligated to do. And especially if you put yourself back 500 years, no public health, no hospitals, there are doctors, but there's no no kind of centralized medical service in the way that we have and take for granted today. Your neighbor's life depends on you in a way that is hard for us to imagine today with all of the resources that we have and facilities that we have today. But notice again that sense of you are obligated to care for your neighbor. And you may flee if those obligations are taken care of. If your neighbor doesn't need you, if they've recovered from the disease, then feel free to go and remove yourself from the danger. And so, really, this overall is the guiding principle for Luther as he's thinking about how you respond to something like this. And so, he even talks about this instinct of self-preservation. And he says, well, this has been implanted in us by God. So this is not forbidden. It's not sinful, to try and protect ourselves, to protect our body, to escape from evil, so long, he says, as it is not done against God and it is not done against neighbor. So long as you are not, denying God, denying your faith in order to do this, and so long as you are not abandoning your neighbor, and neighbor in this broad sense of all of those people with whom we are in relationship with. As long as you're not abandoning them, then, following this impulse of self-preservation, this is something that actually God has put in us, and it is no sin to follow it. And so this is his reasoning turn. So that the opening argument that he's responding to of saying, well, everyone should just sit and accept God's punishment here. He's now going to start to take a harsher tone towards that. And so let me read this paragraph here that he says, so for those who are saying that fleeing in itself is sinful, no matter the circumstances, getting out of harm's way of a plague is sinful. Christians should just stay put and accept God's punishment with patience or something like that. So this is what he says. He says, by such reasoning, when a house is on fire, no one should run outside or rush to help, because such a fire is also a punishment from God. Anyone who falls into deep water dare not save himself by swimming, but must surrender to the water as to a divine punishment. He says, very well, do so if you can, but do not tempt God and allow others to do as much as they are capable of doing. Likewise, if someone breaks a leg, is wounded or bitten, he should not seek medical aid, but say, it is God's punishment. I shall bear it until it heals by itself. Freezing weather and winter, they also must be God's punishment and can cause death. Why run to get inside or near a fire? Be strong and stay outside until it becomes warm again. We should then need no apothecaries or drugs or physicians, because all illness are punishment from God. Hunger and thirst also are great punishments and torture. Why do you eat and drink instead of letting yourselves be punished until hunger and thirst stop of themselves? He says, ultimately, such talk, that is the argument that we should just sit and receive whatever bad or evil comes at us. He says, ultimately, such talk will lead to the point where we abbreviate the Lord's Prayer so that we no longer pray, deliver us from evil. Amen. Since we would have to stop praying to escape these things if they are all God's punishment. He says, where would all of this end? As you see, while there is something perhaps admirable in this desire to be strong, to show that we do not fear death, he says if you take this to its extreme, you end up just, letting the house burn down around you while you don't even go outside. You end up, if you fall into water, just saying, well, this is the way it must be, and drowning. Or if you, it gets cold outside, that's my favorite one, just be strong and stay out until warm weather comes. You get led into these ridiculous places. And so he's really becoming a lot harsher on this sort of reasoning. And so it is okay. In fact, it is good. I mean, we're given this in the Lord's Prayer to pray against evil, deliver us from evil. And it's good to take precautions against evil, because still we know that, if God really desires or wills for us to fall to one thing or another, no precautions are going to prevent it anyway. So it's not as though we don't trust God, or we're denying our faith in God or something like that when we take precautions against these things. And he says, of course, we must act similarly towards our neighbor. So we're doing whatever we can, even if it comes at risk to ourselves, in order to protect and to care for them. And at this point, he actually suggests, public hospitals would be an excellent use of government resources, so he's a bit ahead of his time here, making this suggestion. And so he also is giving advice about, he thinks that this is caused by evil spirits who poison the air, and so he's thinking about ways to prevent this from spreading, as giving advice about fumigating the air or something like this, which it's pretty close. It's not all the way there, but it's getting close to what's actually going on. Again, this is long before the cause of these diseases has been discovered and understood. And so he recognizes that being close to those who are infectious or those who are infected could endanger us. So he understands this. However, he says, this cannot in and of itself be a reason to keep us away from our neighbor in need. And so he even says, if you feel that sense of fear of going close to your neighbor who is sick, or disgust, the plague is a very it is not a pretty disease. If you feel disgust, that makes you want to recoil in horror from what they are experiencing. He says, recognize that that's the devil actually trying to prevent you from doing loving your neighbor as God and Christ commands. And so he gives this, thing that you should respond to the devil with, which is great. If you ever read much Luther, you'll see he often is, sometimes he'll put words in the devil's mouth, but he's often putting words in his or our mouth against the devil, and they're often wonderful. So I'm just going to read some of that one. He says, this is how you should answer the devil when you feel that way. Get away, you devil, with your terrors. Just because you hate it, I'll spite you by going all the more quickly to help my sick neighbor. And then he goes on, if Christ shed his blood for me and died for me, why should I not expose myself to some small dangers for his sake and disregard this feeble plague? If you can terrorize, Christ can strengthen me. If you can kill, Christ can give life. If you have poison in your fangs, Christ has far greater medicine. Should not my dear Christ, with his precepts, his kindness, and all his encouragement, be more important in my spirit than you, roguish devil, with your false terrors in my weak flesh? God forbid. Get away, devil. Here is Christ, and here am I, his servant in this work. Let Christ prevail. Amen. I just love these sorts of statements from Luther. So he then describes, so he's giving advice. I mean, again, we get this principle, right? You are obligated to care for your neighbor. And so he describes these two sinful responses now, on the left hand, on the right hand, on the one hand and on the other. So on the one hand, one sinful response are those who refuse to help their neighbor because they do not wish to put themselves in harm's way. And he says, they like to claim that, well, if it was, Jesus who was sick, or if it was Mary, Jesus's mother, who was sick, surely we would go and help. He says, no, if you won't go help your neighbor, you wouldn't help if it were Christ either. You're deceiving yourself. Whatever you might tell yourself, you are, if you're not going to help your neighbor who's there, because Christ says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me, right? And so he says you wouldn't do that. So that's one sinful response, is to neglect those who are in need out of fear of putting yourself in danger. On the other hand, he says, now you can see him, he's going to come even stronger out against that initial position. On the other hand, he says, the other sinful response are those who throw caution to the wind and who needlessly expose themselves to danger and refuse any medical treatment in order to, prove how independent they are. And so I'm going to quote him here. This is what he says. This is not trusting God, but tempting God. God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. So that's another sinful response now. So both neglecting your neighbor, but also being reckless regarding the disease, as though you were somehow immune to it. And then he also mentions there's even worse, is if you go and you are infected, you needlessly expose yourself through your own negligence, and then you go and you infect others who might have otherwise survived. And he's very strong against this. This is what he says. He says, someone who does this is thus responsible before God for his neighbor's death and is a murderer many times over. This is real. We have real impact over our neighbors in times like these. We have real influence over what's going on, and so this is if by your recklessness you get infected and infect someone else, you are accountable for that. This is what Luther is arguing. And so finally, he gives this kind of summary of how to respond to this. So I'm just going to read this paragraph here. He says, use medicine. Take potions which can help you. Fumigate house, yard, and street. Shun persons and places wherever your neighbor does not need your presence or has recovered. And act like someone who wants to help put out the burning city. What else is the epidemic but a fire, which instead of consuming wood and straw devours life and body? You ought to think this way. Very well, by God's decree, the enemy has sent us poison and deadly offal. Therefore I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order to not become contaminated and thus to perchance infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely, as stated above. See, he says, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy, and it does not tempt God. So, what does this have to do with us? What lesson can we draw from this for our situation today? Well, I think the first thing to realize is that it is no sin to desire to protect ourselves. As Luther says, this is a natural impulse that he says is implanted by God to preserve our body. And if we act as though it is a sin to desire to protect ourselves, then we ought to go the whole way and not come in when it becomes cold, or stop eating and drinking just because we're hungry, and so on. No, this is not a sin to desire to protect ourselves. That is fine. However, the desire to protect ourselves, of self-preservation, is limited by, is checked by the need of our neighbor. And neighbor, again, understood in this large way, including our family members, our friends, those people we do business with, even all the way to the person you pass in the grocery store, or the person you drive by on the street, or the person you haven't even met, but who lives in your community, who's pays taxes to support the same school district, and so on. This neighbor identity has a very large understanding of it. And so our self-preservation as Christians is limited by the needs of our neighbor. And so if your neighbor is in an emergency type of need, then you are obligated to care for that as you can. Now, in our day and age, rarely is that going to be taking them into our home and caring for them. It may be calling an ambulance for them, right? We have a centralized, a public health system that cares for people in this way, in a way that Luther could only sort of imagine in his day. And so that's the second thing. So first, it's no sin to desire to protect ourselves. Second, that is limited by the need of our neighbor. And then third, we're responsible to God not only for our neighbor, but also for our community, right? So this is kind of a piggyback off the second point. And so we must act cautiously for the sake of the community. So this, of course, is where these stay-at-home orders and these social distancing things come in. Just because we have no reason to fear death, because we know that Christ has conquered death, does not mean that we ought to be reckless and risk the chance of infecting others. So we know much more about this today, about how disease is spread and the sorts of things we can do to mitigate that spread. And so we have an obligation to protect the community by doing what we can to keep this, fire of the epidemic from spreading. As I love that analogy that he uses, it's a fire that consumes not wood and straw, but life and body. And you can think of this epidemic in the same way, that we need to do what we can to prevent the spread, and we do that by listening to our public health officials and obeying these stay-at-home orders. This is actually a Christian duty that we are given by God's command. Lastly, I want to read just this one sentence that he says that I just was struck by, because it sounded just like something, a public health statement that somebody, one of our governor's office, or Dr. Anthony Fauci or somebody might say. But this is what Luther says. He says, if the people in a city were to show themselves bold in their faith, maybe they wouldn't mention the faith part, were to show themselves bold in their faith when a neighbor's need so demands, and yet cautious when no emergency exists, and if everyone would help ward off contagion as best they can, then the death toll would indeed be moderate. I mean, this is what we are called to do. So there have been churches and Christian leaders who have been, advocating to continue gathering for worship during times like this. That if we trust in God, God will protect us from this virus. God will keep us from getting sick. And I think, clearly after reading Luther here, Luther's judgment on that sort of advice would be that you are needlessly and recklessly endangering people, and that should they get sick, that is on you for organizing this. And I think that's right. At the same time, the concern for spiritual needs is real. We do need to keep tending to the spiritual needs of people in times of uncertainty and difficulty like now. Partly because of the advent of technology, the fact that I can record a video and upload it and you can watch it, means that this can be done in ways that are safe and are, not going to spread the virus. And so this is why we've made the decisions that we have. Obviously, the governor's order mandates this for us. But even once the stay-home order is lifted, whatever that looks like and whenever that is, everything's so uncertain, we will need to be, as a church, very careful about the ways that we begin to come back together again, and about how we can do that in a way that honors all of our needs, our spiritual needs, but also our bodily needs, in a way that is responsible to our neighbors, to each other, and to our wider community. And so these are the sorts of things that have been guiding my thinking during this pandemic, and I hope they're perhaps useful for you as you're thinking about what your obligations are to family members, to friends, to those who live alone that you know of, and how you can make decisions that are responsible decisions and ethical decisions in light of the promise of resurrection, the defeat of death that we are celebrating in this Easter season, as well as God's command that we ought to love our neighbors ourselves, that Jesus sends us to love just as he has loved us. Again, this is during this Easter season, the next several weeks anyways, however long this goes, I will be posting these videos. I think Thursdays is a good day for me to post them. I invite you to send me any questions, any topics that you're interested in hearing about, and I'll do my best to address them as I can. But as it goes, I'll just be sort of, picking what seems interesting to me and good to me. Maybe we'll settle in on another series, part of the catechism or something like that in the meantime. But please do let me know what you would be interested in hearing in these videos, and I'll do my best to address them. Thanks, and have a great day today. God be with you.